Hi there, I'm Porter Anderson, Editor-in-Chief at Publishing Perspectives, and we're delighted that you've joined us here at Frankfurt Conference. We hope we will be actually seeing many of you in person next week in Frankfurt. But if not, stay with us digitally right through the show. We're going to have a very new and interesting facility called Frankfurt Studio operating, which will be originating content from Frankfurter Buchmesse and putting it right online for you to see on the homepage of the Buchmesse site. So make sure you stay with us next week, even if from afar. And we'll see you next year in person, I hope, if you can't be with us this year. I am delighted to introduce to you, as Hannah was telling you, Siv Bublitz and Marco Garcia. Siv is the president and publisher of S. Fischer Verlag in Frankfurt, one of the great independent houses of Germany. And Marco is working with V&R Editoras Brazil. That is the Brazilian arm of a company, he'll tell us a bit more about this, that began in Argentina. We're talking today about a very interesting question of editorial strategies, but in two different directions, in two different areas, in two different contexts. One is quantity, and the other is quality. We like to think they go hand in hand all the time. There actually are some pretty specific issues to talk about in this regard. I'm going to start with Siv and ask her to tell us something about the question of quantity. And what we're talking about here is the output of a house. How many titles are coming out each year? Is it possible to say, as sometimes you hear someone say rather quietly in our industry, there are too many books? Or is that not the problem? If that is the problem, how do you approach it? How do you think about this? We want to look at the case of Fischer because Siv's done a very interesting job. There's an interview with her on our homepage at Publishing Perspectives, if you'd like to look at it later, in which she'll give you a great deal of detail, in which when she arrived to become the chief at the company, she realized that it just felt a bit too big. But as she'll explain to us, and in fact, Siv, I'll let you talk to us about this, it wasn't a question of saying, we want to do fewer books, let's set a number and just cut until we get down to that number, right?
That's perfectly right. Hello, first of all, I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks for having me. I have to, I mean, you're always perfectly right, Porter, but there's one thing I have to correct. We're not an independent house. I mean, we are independent, we feel independent, but we are part of the Holtzbrink company that owns a number of publishing houses. Now, I'm flattered that I'm the one to speak on quantity, whereas Marco will talk about quality, but I'll do my very best and get to it from that angle. You're right. What we realized when I first arrived in 2017 was that we felt we were publishing too many books, not in an absolute sense, because as you said, there can't be too many books. There are 70,000 new books each year on the German market. Now, this is counting everything, really everything, manuals, whatnot, everything that's printed, but 70,000 is a huge figure. And we were providing just about 400 of those. So it sounds like a really tiny figure. And I think for a publishing house our size and tradition, that's really not huge. But we felt we couldn't focus on the books anymore. And we felt that we weren't really getting to the stage where you feel you're at a conveyor belt and you're just churning out books all the time. But we felt we were lacking time and room, as it were, space to make those books visible. And the point, of course, in publishing is not just to print books, but to get them out there and find readers for them. And that's quite a complicated and challenging job. And so what we did is we downsized, not to a particular figure, but we just felt, we wanted to reduce the number of books we were putting out. We are now down to about 250 books, which partly has to do with the pandemic because everyone's downsizing, cutting down their new books as well, because the bookshops haven't got back into shape yet. But we're not aiming at a particular number. We're trying to just not publish more books than we can feel we publish well. And I think that's the main effort. We started that about 3-4 years ago, and it sounds as though we've reduced our output by half, but it doesn't really feel like it.
It's such an interesting case because what you're bringing us to now is the quality of the quantity. You're quite right that nobody gets away from this session without talking about quality, because as we were discussing when we were speaking of this earlier, it's a question of curation, isn't it? I mean, what drives how you are making these choices?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think there are 2 points of view. First of all, there is you just try to be more specific about the books you acquire. And of course, we all know, I mean, we have a list of authors and we love our authors, and our authors regularly publish books. So that's a given. And of course, we publish authors rather than books. So we don't, this is not something that we discuss. But then you know how it is. You pick up books here and there. And of course, avid readers that we are, there is a tendency to do more books all the time. And we've become a bit more selective and a bit more strict about a position on our list for a new book, a new author. In nonfiction, for example, it's not so much about authors, it's more the individual book that counts. So there's a lot of leeway to discuss, should we pick up this and should we really get behind it? And what we're doing is we're discussing this within the house. So, it's all the different departments, editorial. It's still the editorial part that makes the choice, but we're consulting. We're sort of, we're discussing projects. We also consult with our authors. And because we find that in a way, publishing is like a kind of conversation that books have with each other. And so we like our authors and our books to sort of, talk to each other, if you will. And so when we make a commitment, we go rather a long way. And that's not always easy, because we all know that acquisition is kind of a sport. You need to be quick and, because there's always a competition. But somehow we manage to be we try at least to make a very conscious decision. And that helps us. And the other thing, the other way to look at it, we discussed that in the interview as well, is a bit mystical, because it is my view that a publishing house has a DNA, and you can call that a tradition. In the case of Fischer, it really is a tradition, because we've been around for 135 years. So, that's a long time to pick up an identity, if you will. But I've also worked at other houses that weren't that long around, and I've also always had the feeling that somehow there is a kind of identity, and that some books are more likely to be part of this than others, and that is something that guides us as well. So it's discussion, it's the concrete, the acquisition situation. Do we need this? Do we want this? Do we really want it? And is it vital for us in a way? And the other thing is it part of us? And it sounds a bit mythical, but maybe you can imagine. I see Marco nodding. So, I think publishers can somehow feel what I mean, although it sounds really spiritual.
Yeah, as we'll find when we talk together, Marco's very, very close to what you're saying. He understands quite well from his own experience. One of the things I love hearing you say, as you talk about consulting with authors, and in nonfiction in particular, I know that many of our nonfiction authors here in the States and in several other markets have said that they were always required to have a platform, that no one would even look at them without a platform. And this, of course, steers toward the idea of repetition, of the same authors coming back and back and back and back, which can be terrific if they're great and everybody wants more of their content. But particularly for someone trying to start out, no matter how good their book may be, if they're not able to show platform, they feel that they won't be necessarily given much consideration. It sounds to me that in this great conversation your team is having, there's a lot more room for someone to come in from outside and wow everybody with a standing single book, and perhaps not the platform that everybody might have wanted to see in terms of marketing. Yeah.
That's right. I think we've just somehow raised the stakes for acquiring new books. That's probably the bottom line. And we need to be very enthusiastic, but not only enthusiastic, because enthusiasm is something that comes with a job. You can't be an editor when you're not enthusiastic. You need to be an absolutely irrepressible optimist, because who else could live with a string of failures? I mean, I've been publishing for 30 years. I love it. I've had my successes, but I've also had a long sequence of things that didn't work for various reasons.
You've never had a failure, so don't try to fool us.
No, but I mean, we know that, you know, we try to do really good work, and I think what we're focusing on, and I think it's about focus. What we can do better as in publishing is to get more focus and to get, you know, even more time and energy onto the individual book. This is something that we can do, and I felt very much this is what we should do, and this is what we in a way owe our authors and also the books. So that's what you can do. But we all know that this, of course, doesn't mean that the book will be an initial bestseller the minute it comes out, just because you've worked very hard and you've been very diligent about it and you've made a good choice. No, there are a zillion things that can go wrong, and sometimes they do. Right. So we need some optimism, and you know, you just mustn't curb your enthusiasm in this job. But on the other hand, and this is why it's sometimes really good for us to, from the editorial perspective, to consult with the other parts of publishing, you know, PR and sales, because we get some input on what might be the obstacles, which doesn't mean at all that we're not going for a book if we think it's an important book, but we try to sort of not only imagine what might work about it, which is, of course, first and foremost with editors, always the quality of the book. And we try to sort of figure out how much work it will be, what exactly to do. You know, we're not coming up with a detailed plan, but sort of with an idea. And if we can't really find a good idea, we ask ourselves, is it a good idea to publish this book? Are we the right publisher? If we can't come up with a kind of, you know, if somehow we maybe like the book, but we can't come up with something within our framework to really get it to the reader or find the readership. So it is a conversation, but it's a challenging conversation. In a way, we're trying to challenge each other in a friendly and positive and enthusiastic way.
That's excellent. You've said this very well. And in fact, in terms of conversation, let's talk to Marco for a minute, because there is a very different kind of conversation going on in his market, in the Brazilian market, I've discovered, from what we are thinking of and doing and talking about in some of the other markets of the world right now when we say diversity. What I was curious to know when I first started speaking with Marco for this session today is, if you're in Brazil, if you're working in publishing, what do you mean there when you say diversity? I can tell you from the US market, from the UK market, from many of the European markets, exactly the most prominent factors of diversity being worked on in various ways, and in many cases, wonderful ways in publishing right now. In Brazil, Marco has told me there is such a question as own voices, by which he means Brazil's own voices. And this actually is a question that comes into play in diversity. Marco, can you talk to us a little bit about this and tell us? One of the first things you said to me when I said, are you worried about diversity in Brazil? He said it's an absolute imperative. So it's very much on the mind, but it may be of a very different quality from what we expect in some of the other markets. Talk to us about this, Marco.
Yes, it is. Thanks, Porter. Thanks, Siv. And just listening to what Siv just said about possibilities, about obstacles, and about to be being responsible and being aware of these demands and being aware of diversity, as you said. I remember back then in Frankfurt 2013, Brazil was the guest of honor of Frankfurt Book Fair. And at the opening ceremony, a Brazilian author called Luis Rufato, he was doing his speech and talking about how diverse and how unequal, I would say, Brazil is. At that time, Brazil was the 7th economy in the world, or something, known as its beautiful natural scenarios and so on and on and on. But also Brazil at that point has rates of functional illiteracy around 20% or more. We a country where we find like high rates of violence against women, LGBT, at that time, 2013, LGBT, now it's LGBTQIAP+, but at that time it was LGBT, we were talking about that. We had high rates of racial violence against Black and Indigenous people. So many voices that need to be heard. And at that time, it was a sort of paradox, being in a literature celebration, where literature it's a place who gives voices to those ones that need to be heard. And on the other side, we had a country where sometimes we have so little to celebrate. And it's been 8 years ago. Those needs, they remain. And those voices need to be heard. So listening and approaching your audience is crucial, is mandatory. That's what we talked earlier when we discussing. And we are trying to find balance to give voices to those demands, I'd say. And when I say we, not only VR as a publisher, but the Brazilian market. You can see some other publishers giving more space for these questions. And it brings us another aspect of it when you're trying to find balance between voices that resonates here in Brazil and things that are universal, worldwide, because you have those sort of issues everywhere, but you have specific ones here in Brazil. So, for instance, here at VR, we have 3 different imprints. One is for children's books. Another one is YA fiction. And we have another one, nonfiction for adults. And obviously, having in mind the peculiarities of each one of these imprints, of these segments, diversity is mandatory. On children's sides, for instance, books like Saturday for Old Moura, brilliant one, that we have to give voice to that. In our YA section, we have like I'll Be the One from Laila Lee, and Ace of Spades for Farida Abiki Amidi, for instance. We brought them to our catalog. Our catalog is being more and more diverse since, like, say, a couple of years ago from now. So we have those voices, those questions, they are universal. We know that, but we noticed once we get closer, and we have to get closer to the reader, to the consumer, we know the importance of the local voices, the local issues that has to be approached in a sense. So we know the importance of the Brazilian reader. So, and these matter of own voices, it impacts buying and selling rights, and developing and creating and giving space to Brazilian authors, to Brazilian content as well. So the closer you get to the consumer, again, respecting that universal aspect of the issues that has to be discussed, but the closer you get to the consumer here in Brazil, more voices you realize that need to be heard, need to be talked, to discuss. So we found that the consumer, the reader, they're seeking for truth here and there. And our marketing as well have to have it in mind. And our sales team, our marketing team, our design team, just referring to what Siv said about those discussions with the whole team, with the company, with the publisher, the publishing house as a whole. So we have to discuss that. So, for instance, when it comes to nonfiction, Here, when nonfiction in Brazil, probably Brazilian author for nonfiction approaches some aspects, some issues with a closer and more truthful way of dealing with that. So one of our recent releases is about personal finance and about financial education. And the author is a Brazilian Black woman from a very, very humble background. And considering this area where finance, personal finance, and her profile is completely different from the ones like usually are male, man, white, wealthy people. So her voice had, we noticed, we researched that her voice resonates in a part of the audience, of the readers, that needed to be heard, and we talk closer to them. So in our team, I would say as well, talking about what Siv just said as well, we have to leave this diversity as well, because our team is diverse in terms of cultural aspects, racial aspects, sex and gender aspects, sexual orientation. Our team is diverse. So the way we discuss new possibilities to new books, to new subjects to be approached, we talked about that in a diverse environment as well. And I think it's very necessary. It's mandatory. So this is a little bit of our perspective here in Brazilian markets and here at V&R.
Now, this is terrific. And I'm going to ask Hannah to join us if we have some questions coming in from our audience. One of the questions that I was just about to ask you, Marco, and you started to work your way right toward it, is have you, as some of the publishers I know, worked very hard to be sure that your own staff's diversity does in fact reflect these own voices, Brazil's own voices, the environment in which you're operating? Some of our publishing houses have tried to make some very fine adjustments and some hiring efforts, really good outreach to try to make sure that they have people on board who know where to find the material they want to listen to and who know where to bring in new voices, if you will. Were you already, I guess is what I'm asking, were you already a very diversely staffed house, or have you worked on that?
I would say since the beginning, we are diverse, we are. And when we built up our YA imprint, for instance, like 6 years ago, I guess, the way that team was searching for titles and for subjects that need to be taught reflected that diversity that we had at home already. So it was a kind of natural, but obviously there are some other issues, other subjects that come to discussion here and there. And obviously when we hire, for instance, a translator or a designer or an illustrator, we have it in mind. We think this diversity has to be there, because again, as I said, the consumers, the readers, they're looking for truth, and I think it's more likely you succeed. Again, as Siv said, we know some success, but we know a long list of failures here and there as well. But we notice when we have to approach that kind of needs, of kind of relationships.
I think that's so interesting. Siv, when you and I were talking about questions of diversity, you were making the point that in some ways, the German population itself is not as diverse as some of the other cultures in the world, and certainly as a Brazil, as a comparative. For example, there's more homogeneity, isn't there, in the culture there?
That's right. Our issues, I think, are very different because we don't have that kind of cultural diversity in Germany. We're far more homogeneous, but there are, of course, differences. And they're also, I mean, it's a question of justice as well. And it used to be a very plain question in Germany until very recently of men and women. There were so many more male authors and men, not in publishing as such in the jobs, but the saying was women in publishing twice as many, half as powerful. So as soon as you got to, level, rights director level, that was about the top job that women had in publishing until about 10 years ago. And now it's changed. It's really drastically changed. We have a number of female CEOs. When I first started out as a CEO in 2007, I was boring Porter with this little anecdote, but it's really, it's incredible, isn't it? I was the first publisher in Germany to be hired, not to be, someone who hadn't founded or inherited. It's the first female publisher. Right. Now there are lots of us, and that's better. And so there's so many more female voices in the literary range and on the list. And we have this distinction between East Germany and West Germany. We're a unified country now, but there are too few voices from the former eastern part of Germany. So we're really working on that. And I absolutely agree with you. I think the books are as diverse as the team is. So our best effort has to be to create diverse teams, and then to be selective and to make good choices in the books we publish.
Yeah, exactly. It's such a good point, really coming from both of you, and to hear it from two such different cultures just really underlines the importance of reflecting the readership inside the publishing house, something that I think many of us are working on and watching everyone else around us work on. We're starting to get our signals that we're coming close to the end of this session, and shortly the music will play us off just like at the Oscars. Hannah, do you have a question that you wanted to put to us before we move on?
I did. I hope we can ask it in about a minute, because since we're talking about editorial strategies, there's always kind of a dichotomy, or there's two sides to choosing a book. How much emphasis do you put on subjective factors like taste and quality versus economic factors like how well will this book sell? And how does that influence it? Because I'm sure there are some books that you want to publish that maybe aren't going to be bestsellers. Do you proceed with that, or do you decide not to publish them?
I'm very clear about that. On the commercial side, we try to make good predictions about sales, and we try to be right. And it is more predictable on the commercial side, and it's more plannable. So it doesn't always work, but in most of the time, and there on that side of publishing, that really is our point. And I saw in the chat, I saw the question, how do you cater to millennials? Which books do you? This is the kind of thinking that we have and we have a big commercial list. And this kind of professional thinking is very, and there's also a lot of enthusiasm from the point of view of, it's got to be good books, but we're talking sales here. On the literary list and on the upmarket nonfiction list, it's different. But I think to sell a book well is not important only because it's economically important, but it's also important because you need to reach an audience. And if you take on the responsibility to publish a good book, I think your aim should be to sell it well, because it means you get a lot of readers.
I want to thank you both for joining us. This has been a
pleasure.
Fantastic discussion.
A pleasure. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you both, Marco, Siv. Thank you.